this presentation. Thank you, Yannick.
Thank you so much. That's very kind of you. Thank you, Susan. I'm excited to be here because, first of all, I really love teaching. Second, I love existentialism. It really did a lot for my practice. I'll say a few more words about that. Just can I have a quick show of hands? Who's already familiar with existentialism as a philosophy? 1, 2, 3.5, and another quarter. Cool. Have you thought about that in relation to coaching already? Okay, excellent. Who here has never heard about it other than perhaps the term being thrown around as part of a crisis? Cool, so the rest is sort of in between. Good, so I'm here. I brought a bunch of slides. There's no way we're going to get through all of them. I tend to jump through a bunch of stuff. There's a narrative in there. What my aim is to open up some doors into existential philosophy, correct some of the stereotypes around it perhaps, tell a bit of a story about how I use it, and give you a bit of a framework for how that could be done. Now I've just destroyed the first joke that I wanted to make, because what it's like not to know what we're going to be talking about. I see it a lot when I go through life. As soon as I had learned about existentialism, a lot of the things that I had experienced as a human being started to make sense. Well, not necessarily make sense, some things don't make sense, but my experience of it makes sense. So I realized I got a terminology and a framework around what's happening to my experience. Because a lot of the time, that happens. We are being thrown into life. We get born into some country, starting to speak some language, which we have no control over choosing. Even though I did have a conversation once with someone who was of the opinion that he did choose to be born. And I thought, that was amazing. I don't think so, but I really wanted to believe what he believes at that point. What's it like not to know? That's what life often is. We spend so much time trying to make plans and develop strategies and ask people questions to get answers so that we create a bit more certainty in life. Because it feels good, it feels safe, it feels comfortable to have certainty. But then if we have too much of it, then it starts getting boring because we don't have that excitement of not knowing. So I just wanted to put that out there for you to reflect a little bit about what the experience is like of being a human being in this world where we don't really know things. Because we can't really get to a point of complete certainty. You know, at some point there's a threshold after which we make decisions. We are sure enough, you know, to a point where we might call it certain. But actually when we use the method of philosophy to really look at how certain we are, we usually come to the conclusion that actually I'm not that certain. I can be extremely confident that if I try to leave this room, I'll make it. But I don't know, really. You know, lots of things could happen, from a heart attack to a psychotic breakdown of Susan, to somebody stopping me. Maybe the door is locked and I didn't know about it. Planes crashing into buildings. That stuff happens, you know, so we don't really know. So in coaching, I think that's particularly important because we often help, as coaches, we help people to make decisions. And we like to make decisions when we're reasonably certain. So that's one of those themes. But, so I want to start with some of the big questions that people bring into the coaching room. I want to also have you reflect on who's coming into your coaching room. Maybe so far as practice clients, you've been doing this for, you had a day or two? You're relatively fresh to this?
Well, there's lots of experience in the room, but also 3 weeks here working with each other.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Who's got coaching experience prior to starting this course? A couple of you, okay, good. You don't need coaching experience to ask yourself big questions. It's just a really good way of finding some answers for yourself. So I have a bunch of examples for that. I want to talk you through the human condition, because that's really what existentialism is about, to look at what it means to be alive, to grasp in language. But I've got a couple of examples for you. And I want to provide you a little bit of a framework for how existential coaching as such could look like, or how the existentially minded or existentially informed coach might practice. There's a couple of practical guidelines. I have them all in there. If we have time, I'd love to just go through that because I think there's a really good insight into how it could look like in practice. But let's see how time treats us today. I do that exercise, perhaps not now with you, but in weekends I like to do that. If you just take a few moments to kind of fill that on in your mind, you might continue the sentence in lots of different ways. From I am a man or a woman or anything in between, to I'm humorous or I'm rich or I'm from a certain geographical area. If you start stripping all of these labels away, you start getting to something that comes closer to existence, one layer at a time. You can think of it as an onion, like we want to get to the core of what being there means. Because Sartre said, existence precedes essence. All these labels that come after, we're just being human, we're just being there. And that's really interesting experience because our coaching clients and ourselves, we like to put all of these labels and categories on top of us. We like to attach those things to us. They make up our identity. But what if somebody loses their job, gets made redundant, their partner leaves them, they lose their health, or they move country and they lose their sense of humor because now nobody gets them anymore, you know? That can be stripped away. You're still there, so you're still human. So when you can connect to that core of what it means to just be there and embrace that human condition, you get to something that's stable, that nobody can take away from you unless you stop existing. And I think that's really, really valuable exercise. It's also scary, because start stripping people's identity layers away, and they tend to get really defensive about it. Because we like to hold on to them. We worked very hard to build some of these layers around us. You know, they become part of us. And if somebody wants to take them away, that might not be a conversation you might want to have. But sometimes you might need to have it because they're getting stripped away. Losing your job. If you've done the existential work beforehand and you know that you are not your job, then losing your job is a lot easier for you psychologically. So developing something I call existential resilience is part of my work as an existential coach, that you have these conversations before those things happen. Because statistically, it's very likely that all of us are going to lose our job at some point in our lives. So who am I? Well, I had that one, but I think some of you will already know a little bit about me from the intro. Thank you very much. And some might have read the bio. I think the question is huge, you know, and anybody here could talk for hours about who they are and try to make sense of it. Some people come to see a practitioner in order to answer that question. I think the most important points have been made. I think what I would like to highlight is that we tend to listen to people differently once we know who they are, or we think we know who they are. Me just leaving those couple of labels and categories on to who I am will allow you to listen to me as with a certain level of authority, or you kind of get a vibe from me in the first couple of minutes or seconds. We build opinions quite quickly. I might tell you that I'm German and write that stereotype for a little bit. And I can be quite efficient, but like, does that make me more intellectual? Maybe yes, maybe no, we don't really know. Point is that we have all of those categories and we make a lot of assumptions about people. And it's really difficult to really know somebody. But when we think we know somebody, it changes how we relate to them. And in coaching, that's particularly important because coaching is always a meeting of two people. And what we assume the other person is like, we're always in relation. So when we take that into our coaching sessions, we start to relate to people differently. We stop making assumptions and we're being really curious who that person really is. I mean, how often have I sat down with an executive or somebody who was lower in the company ladder and came in with certain assumptions, kind of aware what these assumptions are, but then regularly I'm surprised about who that person really is. You know, just because somebody is earning lots of money doesn't mean that they're really good at their job. You know, just because somebody is at the lower end of the organizational spectrum doesn't mean that they're not extremely smart and super capable. You know, so I think that's important when we meet somebody. I try not to read people's websites or too much about people, my clients, before they come in for the first time. I'd love to meet them with a blank slate, which is not often possible because sometimes people get referred, and in organizations particularly, you are expected to do a bit of your homework about who that client is. I really love meeting people for the first time. It's like not watching the trailer before you go see the movie, because you're going to have a lot of expectations about who you're going to meet. We're talking about philosophy, started in early Greece, know thyself, Socrates. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get to know ourselves better. And existentialism as a philosophy it's a method of gaining knowledge about things that are abstract. Science is a method of gaining knowledge about things that we can measure and observe, analyze. Philosophy is about things that are abstract. Ontology is born out of that, the study of being. How do we know something about what it means to be? Because we can't measure being. So that's the starting point of existential philosophy. We're questioning what we think we know through philosophy. What do we think I know about me being here? And what's the result? What are the consequences of me just being here? That's what the existential givens are about. Just being in the world with other people, that does something to us. That creates certain anxieties, that creates certain experiences as a human being. And that's what existentialists are curious about. This is a question that a client asked me in a consultation. They gave me a call, and it was one of the first questions that they asked me. Do you believe in God? I'm like, oh. Perhaps just take a moment how you would respond to that. My response was something like, I'm happy to tell you, but I'm super curious why you asked the question, especially so early in getting to know each other. And very quickly we were in a conversation around, well, I just don't think that anything means anything, and I really would like to believe in God or the concept of it, because it would provide me with some answers to questions that I don't have answers to and that I feel really stuck on. Because why am I doing anything when, it's just at some point it's over, and if we zoom out enough in terms of time, then, nothing that I do does anything or means anything. He said, well, maybe we're all in the Matrix, maybe this isn't real, maybe it's a simulation, but even if it isn't, and I start World War III and get the Earth out of its axis and crash into another planet, on the grand scheme of the size of the universe, that wouldn't really matter much. Nothing that I do or think or say, I don't think, what's the difference? So that's how we started off that conversation. This is 7 minutes in. These conversations excite me, because part of me just wants to be like, oh, but it does, and this and that, but you have to recognize that you're saying that from your own paradigm, because maybe it doesn't mean anything. Is there an overarching meaning of life? Well, maybe is my best answer. I wouldn't want to exclude the possibility, but I couldn't grasp it with my tiny human brain. What I know is that something means something to me because I'm experiencing it. And you could say, yeah, but what if it's an illusion and it's just, that emotion is just your amygdala firing in your brain, and, well, that I don't care because I feel it. That seems pretty real to me. And if it's an illusion that is real, then it's still real to me. So if I experience it, for me that's good enough. I can create my purpose. I can say, that drives me because I feel it. And somebody else might come and say, yeah, but you don't know that, and it's all absurd, and, it doesn't really matter, and if you zoom out to the third moon of Jupiter, then what's it all mean? It means nothing. And I say, well, that's just your opinion, dude. But so can that person say that exact same thing to me. So some slip into kind of nihilism and say, well, nothing means anything, and like it's all pretty bleak. And others slip into religion and say, look, there's answers and you need to have faith. And I respect all of them, because everybody needs to make up their own mind about what they believe about meaning and purpose and whether this all means anything. Yeah.
So you operate on
assumption that humans by default need purpose?
I know that when people are in the bottom 3% of I feel my life is meaningful, and meaning and purpose, they're a bit different, but they're often mentioned together, they're definitely in the same category. People are much more likely to kill themselves. There's good data from the US Army. Martin Seligman has done some research in the US Army and looked at suicide rates, and they have a lot of data, and part of that data was my life is meaningful. So I know from the research that if you're very high...
My life is meaningful or meaning...
Meaningful, so if you're in the lower bottom of my life is very meaningful to me,
Okay.
so meaning if you don't feel that your life has meaning, you're much more likely to kill yourself.
Okay.
Martin Seligman at some point, that was years ago, he mentioned in a conference that they were close to predicting suicide in relation to meaning. So that's pretty powerful data.
You're throwing me. I'm sorry. You said you meant meaningless. Yeah, you said meaningful.
It's just on the scale.
Yeah.
It's on the scale. So like if you're at one end of the scale, that's the scale. That's all.
No meaning, very dangerous.
A moment of meaningful.
Yeah.
I'm tired.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you probably know that if you're in a job that is quite meaningless to you, it doesn't really mean anything, you know, you're just doing a job to make somebody else some money. Like, how motivated are you? How energized are you? How likely are you to put the extra workload in? How motivated are you to look out for your colleagues and then go home and work on your own projects? You know, it's a pretty draining experience to not have meaning in your life. And the thing is that's often a choice. So if you create a space where people can have that conversation without fear of being judged, with somebody who's asking you questions, who's philosophically informed, you can have questions around, well, what is meaning to you? Meaning is this huge, broad concept made up of very different areas. Research on meaning, empirical research on meaning, is still in its infancy. And it's hugely fascinating, but it's extremely subjective. So coaching is a fantastic vehicle for people to choose what is meaningful to them, to allow themselves to connect to something that feels like this is purposeful to me. You know, so if we can create that for people who are not on the verge of absolute breakdown, who don't feel unable to cope, which unfortunately is still the threshold after which people are much more likely to go see a therapist. You know, if we can do that before meaning becomes a problem that you can't cope with anymore, then that's a wonderful way of working with people to strengthen meaning, to build that resilience against future loss of meaning. So, some of the big questions. Should we throw some out in terms of what have clients come to you in the past, or what have you asked yourself in the past? What are some of those big questions that people are concerned with?
Ageism. Am I still wanted in an organization because I'm, say, 50?
Mm-hmm.
55.
Am I too old to be a part of this?
Yeah.
You know, am I still wanted? Am I worthwhile? Am I worthy? What else?
I want to be the partner. I want to be the boss. I want to be the leader. That comes up a lot.
Mm-hmm. What's the question in there?
Look at me, aren't I important? You know, that kind of see me, you know, value me, recognize me.
How can I be recognized? How can I live a life in which I'm valued? How can I connect to other people or get respect from them? How can I relate to others?
Am I in the right job?
Am I in the right job? And make job bigger. What's the bigger question behind this?
Why am I here? What's it all about?
Yeah, now we're talking.
Yeah.
And sometimes the job that means exactly that. Sometimes you're in a job and you're like, is this the right job for me? The underlying question is, what am I doing with my life?
Yeah.
You know, what do I really want to achieve? What kind of legacy do I want to leave behind? How can I do something that's meaningful, that means something? How can I not waste my time? You know, we relatively have very little time on this planet. And regardless whether you believe in an afterlife or not, at some point this body decays. Even though we're not that certain about that anymore because of recent technological advances. I used to say death is a certainty, but now with exponential developments in nanotechnology and biotech, that stuff, we might be able to find a solution for the body decaying. And, you know, how long can the mind exist? One of those big questions that I have certain. You know, when general artificial intelligence is being developed in around 2040, 2050, you know, and the computers have more computing power than our brain. Once machines start learning and make new connections, what's going to happen? You know, are all our problems going to be solved, or are we going to be wiped out like a pest? No, well, I don't know. It's pretty exciting and pretty scary. It's a big question. Who am I? What is my identity? Why am I in this world? What can and what can I not change? How do I make the right choices? How can I be happy? What's expected of me? What should I do with my life? Where do I belong? Who are my people? Can I make a change for the better? To what extent is change actually possible? Can I convert an introvert into an extrovert? If NLP paradigm, if one person can do it, anybody can do it. Do you believe that? What's human nature? Are people genuinely good when they're born, or if we let them roam free, do they bash each other's head in? Jean-Jacques Rousseau, are we a noble savage? Or do we need a Leviathan to keep us all in place? Because we would actually go run wild.
What's a Leviathan?
That's Hobbes. Oh, Leviathan, sorry, that's the entity to keep people in check. You know, so it's a metaphor for, you know, if we just let people roam free, somebody will come, bash you over the head with their tool, steal all of your stuff, and enrich themselves as much as possible. You know, are we driven by love or are we driven by greed? No, I think it's some sort of interplay. We have those forces inside of us. But some people say, no, it's all love. And some people say, no, we're screwed. People are just evil. You know, so these are big questions where we don't necessarily know an answer to. To some extent, we need to choose to believe, what Kierkegaard calls a leap of faith. Not necessarily religious faith, but just bridging uncertainty. And I had a pretty interesting conversation with somebody outside of a bar in Mexico. And as I did, I was just like, hey, what are you into? I'm meeting somebody, and they're like, oh, this and religion. And so we had an interesting conversation around what religion meant to him, because in my view at the time, I was like, well, religion just kind of gives you answers to questions that are unanswerable. And that's pretty comforting, but I'm like, I'm not sure how I feel about that. And the guy, I forgot his name, he said, well, that's not how I see it. For me, any relationship makes your life more complex, not easier. You know, because as soon as you have a relationship with a person, or with an entity, or with a concept, or an idea, then you share responsibility for your actions with that person, or that entity, or that idea. So you can't just do whatever you want anymore, because now things matter. They affect others. And that's pretty big. And I'm like, oh. So as soon as you commit to a relationship, you share responsibility. You accept, you choose to be responsible. So every commitment makes you responsible, which makes you less free, but also gives a lot more meaning and purpose. You know, if we commit to a person, I recently got married, that was a big commitment for me. Yeah. And it did two things. It provided a huge amount of meaning and purpose and direction. I've never worked harder towards a vision, towards a certain outcome or a living situation. You know, thinking about kids and buying houses and things like that. It really focuses a lot and channels a lot of energy. That was amazing. At the same time, a sea of anxiety opened about all these possibilities that I can no longer be now. Because I made that commitment.
But why do you think that reduces your freedom? It gives you new freedom.
Because every choice, by definition, eliminates other possibilities. I can still decide to get divorced and marry a different person, but these years I'll never get back with a different person or on my own.
I always find security when I'm single. I'm not committed.
Sorry, what's that?
I'm sorry, Hugh. I'm saying, what you're saying is, when if I'm in a relationship, I feel like, oh God, I'm suffocating, I'm responsible, I have to make the phone call, I have to let you come over. Not that I don't like the individual, because I like the individual. But there's this, when I'm free, it's like, yes, I can just, because I'm a mother, So I've already got that committed, tied in.
Yeah.
And there's this, so I'm always torn. Do I want a relationship? Do I not? Do I want one? I kind of want one for the preparation of my death. I really don't want to do that on my own. If I'm going to go, can somebody be with me?
Yeah.
You know, next to me.
Yeah.
So it's a real interesting dichotomy.
But then the
Yeah, thank
relationships can, rather than inhibit and create a lack of freedom, can create opportunities and new experiences.
Exactly.
And actually can take you to a completely different.
And that's why when I get in, I'm in.
It's difficult to commit for that reason for many people, because as soon as they do that, they can't just do whatever they want anymore, because they make certain promises to somebody as soon as they commit to something. Go.
I'm really sort of struggling a bit with being slightly philosophical about this, is if I make a choice now, like getting married, that was just a choice in that moment. That moment in time has gone. I can't go back in time.
Yeah.
And I could have made other choices, of course, but it hasn't any choice I would have made, or any choice I wouldn't have made. The freedom doesn't change. It's just that I change. For instance, if I'm now in a relationship or I have children, I have choices around being dad.
Yeah.
Whereas if I'd never made that choice, I would not have had those choices. So the freedoms are just changed. They're not reduced.
So for me, it's what does my wife or what would my children expect from me? And there's a question about what am I saying yes to? Because as soon as I would say yes to a person, I want to spend the rest of my life with you, I would want to live up to that promise that I've given. I have a very strong value in integrity. Some people are more fluid with that, but I do not have the freedom anymore to have sex with anybody I want. I give that freedom up. You know, I do not have the freedom anymore to just travel through Thailand for 6 months. You know, because I gave that freedom up by making a promise that I'll be with her. Do you know what I mean?
It depends how you define freedom, though, doesn't it? Because
True.
then, you might find you have other freedoms by being in a relationship and being able to share burdens, or however you might look at it.
Surely it's like any commitment though, like if you commit to a permanent job, you sign a contract, and you
Correct.
commit to going into 9 to 5 every day, that means that you no longer have the choice to like freelance for other companies or go off travelling on a whim. It doesn't mean that your freedom is gone, it just means you have restricted your freedom in one sense.
Yeah, exactly. It means the consequences of your choices change because of your promises or your commitments. You could still just go for 6 months and do whatever, but there will be consequences to that because of the commitments that you've made, right? So in a way, we're free to do whatever we want, because the only rules that really exist are the rules that we make or the rules that we accept to follow. You know, and that's a hugely liberating aspect of existential philosophy, that you are really free to do whatever you want at any point in time. You can choose to be a bank robber and try to make it to Hawaii. You know, I can't even argue with that if you think that's a good idea and it's coherent in itself, and you're like, look, I had this very long conversation with somebody very long time ago who was just on a path of self-destruction. He would call it a path of making the most out of time, out of life, and if it ends any moment, that's fine. You know, so he was trying out all the drugs and he was doing all the partying, and he was just like a pure hedonist, and he's like, look, if I die at 30, it's fine. If I die tomorrow, that's okay too. I'm making the most out of it every minute. And it was so shocking to my paradigm that I had at the time that we argued for a long time. Well, we explored, we had a friend in common, we had a good relationship, but at the same time, like, how can you live like that? That's stupid. And he's like, well, how can you live like you? That's stupid. You know, and I couldn't find a hole in his logic. It was a very different paradigm, but in itself, it made sense, given the values and beliefs that this person had. So I had to respect it. I didn't like it. I knew he was going to make my friend very sad, you know, because I could see there's a dark path ahead for this guy, but also I can't know. And he decided he wanted to live his life that way. And if somebody decides to live their life a certain way, as a coach, I can tune into that and make sure that that person understands the consequences of their actions.
But is that your, right there, that's a problem, because you're saying your way, your understanding of the consequences of his action. So how is that? Does that make sense? you know, you're feeding him what you believe will be the consequences of his hedonistic behavior. So how, as a coach,
so back then I wasn't a coach, I was a friend, so it was a different conversation. If I think myself as a coach in that situation, and I've been in similar situations, I'm still a human being and I'm concerned about this person. If I see somebody driving towards a brick wall at 200 miles an hour, I would feel obliged to say, do you see that brick wall?
right?
You're going pretty fast.
So as an existentialist coach, you can say, you see that wall, or that heroin's not probably a good idea.
Well, that's a value judgment. I can say, do you know what heroin does to the human body and the human mind? Do you understand the addiction potential of heroin? Or like, I've read these articles. In my understanding, heroin is pretty addictive, and lots of people like have pretty dark path ahead of them if they try it. Have you considered that?
Okay.
You know, and then that person will hopefully give you a response that is considered, or perhaps they think about it for the first time with you. Both would be okay. The difficulty for me sometimes is just to accept that people make their own choices and I disagree with them. That's something we need to bracket.
But as an existentialist, you say you disagree. Does that mean you believe in absolute truisms or not?
Well, some things are factual, right? For example, I mean, my education is academic, you know, so I know science is a pretty good method of acquiring knowledge. It's not an absolute truism, but some things are just objectively true. The earth is round, and I know there's people out there arguing that it's not, but it's something we know, and whether somebody has a personal truth that it's not, there is a factual truth that it is.
So just to extend that a little bit then, so given you're coaching someone, he says or she says, actually, I've decided I've had enough of the corporate life, I'm going to be a bank robber. I'm going to rob the Bank of England and go to Hawaii. As an existentialist, are you in a position to say that is probably not a good idea, or would you say that's absolutely wrong and you shouldn't do it?
Well, as an existential coach, I would never say that's wrong and you shouldn't do it. I could say, I believe that's wrong, and I think you shouldn't do that. But look, you live your life, and I live mine. If you wanted to do that and go ahead with it, and you wanted some coaching on it, I'm the wrong coach for you.
Can I just make an ethical point here as well? In that, and obviously, when you're contracting with your clients, I know we're talking sort of philosophically here. If somebody in a coaching relationship talks about doing something that is illegal or damaging to another, you have an ethical responsibility to address that. So I know we're having a light-hearted discussion about it, but if somebody says, I hate my wife and I'm going to kill them, you have an obligation to deal with it, even if you can understand their perspective. Yeah. Sorry, just...
No, you're absolutely right to underline that point. The point is you need to bring the conversation up. If somebody then actually, do no harm, we have a duty of care. If somebody is going to get hurt as a result of this person's action, we have a moral duty to step in. Depending on the country we are in, there's different obligations of what we need to do, but I think that's a conversation for another point perhaps. Because some practitioners in some countries, they're obliged to go to the police, and in some countries it's much more blurry than that. Also, at what point where do you find harm, and where's the threshold to harm? So that's very interesting questions. Ethics is a series of questions you need to ask yourself. There's also very few clear rules, unfortunately.
Huge question.
Might be a question to shelve for later, like even another lecture, but this thing about ethics and things like your duty of care and having to report things and behave in an ethical manner. My understanding is there is no coaching professional requirement to do that because you're not part of a sort of legally incorporated profession that I'm aware of. So as an engineer, I have certain obligations to maintain my title of chartered engineer. But if I want to, as a coach, where does that ethics come from? Does it come from your personal value system? Does it come from the legal framework of the country you're in, which you just implied? Where does that come from?
These are very important questions. You'll have a session on that, I assume?
We do.
Okay,
We've
because
got a whole
that would,
evening on-
I have a 4-hour session on ethics where that's kind of a starting point. It would go too far. To bring it to existentialism, I like existentialism partly for that reason, that you are more free in what's allowed, because you are free to do whatever you want as long as you're aware of the consequences. So as a coach, I always tell students who you are is how you coach. You know, the person you are, what you bring onto the table, the kind of human being you are, the attitude, the mindset that you have, the way of being with another person. You know, I'm quite challenging and quite direct. You know, other people are very caring, sensitive. You know, there's so many different people in this room, and you'll all have different styles of coaching. You know, and existentialism provides a framework to understand people better and their paradoxes and dilemmas and conflicts, but it allows you to be authentic, to be who you are, and then practice in that way. If you look at 10 existential coaches, they'll all be practicing very differently to each other. You know, there is no thought leader like Freud. You know, Kierkegaard was the first to write about it. You know, Nietzsche and Sartre and Heidegger, there were people who wrote about it, but they all disagreed on many different points. What they agreed on is the existential givens, the core of the human condition. And that's what I want to just put out there. These big questions, by the way, I'll send you the slides later so you can look at the ones that we skip over quickly. You can group them in what matters to people is to exist rather than not exist, to have agency, which is basically what we're dealing with coaching. We're trying to help people make choices and create autonomy, so we open new doors, new pathways into the future. And happiness, people want to be happy on some level. That's a different lecture, and you can watch that here. That's the one I gave last time. I'll bring that positive psychology aspect into it. Because happiness is a very big subject with a lot of subcategories, and it's useful to understand it. I think it's just as useful to understand the things that are going well and that we're working towards, but also to understand the depth and the anxiety and the complexity, the dark side of human existence, not just the upside. I think we need to understand both. Hence, me bringing those two together, that made a lot of sense to me. Here are some of the existential philosophers. Søren Kierkegaard, Friedrich Nietzsche, Heidegger, Jean-Paul Sartre. I'll just leave them there. Here's a couple of the existential practitioners who took by the way, quite a white male bunch, except for Simone. Still a very white middle-aged bunch, but I'm not quite sure where that rationale for that is, because we're all human. Maybe it's just that middle-aged white people just have more time to philosophize because they're less. But like, we need to change that.
Maybe privilege.
Yeah. There's something about being able to think about these things, because there's a good point in there, because when we're just busy doing life, we often don't really think about the bigger questions. They deeply influence our choices and how we live. These questions, these bigger questions underneath those questions like, am I in the right job? You know, there's bigger questions underneath. I think this is real value that existential coaching brings to a client. It's the invitation to just slow down, take some time, and consider some of the deeper questions underneath.
This is probably an ignorant question, but I think you've alluded to it. When you look at this, it's through a very Western sort of thought paradigm. And are there existential practitioners and leading thinkers in other cultures? So I'm sure there must be. It isn't the preserve of the West to think in a certain way.
What I found is in conversations with practitioners from all over the world, that stuff resonates, but they have a different framework for it. They have different terminology. So people have always thought about the human condition, you know, and concepts like, well, we have a certain amount of anxiety just because we are here and we don't know when we're going to go, you know, in essence, that's not really new. What I like is the packaging that comes together. And there are in other parts of the world, for example, the last existential therapy World Congress was in Buenos Aires. So it does go around the world, but there are some differences in how people phrase it, explain it, the storytelling behind it, for example.
Because partly behind my question is then if you are an existential coach, but you're coaching people from a different cultural background, how easily do the concepts translate?
Well, the good thing is that you're not trying. In the beginning, when I got in touch with that philosophy, I was very passionate about it, and I wanted to open people's eyes that this is a really good philosophy to have. And as a coach, that's not helpful. You know, so oftentimes people don't really know that I'm into existential philosophy when I coach them, particularly in organizations where I don't come in with that angle. You know, the questions matter, but we don't go into the depth of philosophy when we work. It helps me to understand their dilemmas and conflicts better. It allows me to perhaps open that door into, well, what if this is just absurd? You know, that term organizational absurdity. I see it all the time. I might not call it absurdity, because that might not be a term that resonates with somebody, but why the hell would that person make this decision? This doesn't make any sense at all. It's against everything that we believe in. Like, they don't even need the money. I don't understand. Well, what if it doesn't make any sense? How many people spend decades to figure out the answer to a question that might not have one? You know, so existing within this life where some things might just not make sense, but being a meaning-making machine, you know, we always try to make sense of things. It's one of the worst things that can happen to a human being when something doesn't make sense. We're trying to figure things out. You know, this is amazing ability of us, an amazing tendency for human beings to grow and develop and learn. It allowed us to grow so much as a species because we figure things out quite naturally. Give somebody a riddle and they're like, oh, I wonder what the answer to this is. You know, some people don't care, fair play, but like, we have an innate learn and drive to learn. When babies, they go explore and they try to figure stuff out. You know, that's part of the human the human nature. You know, so I think that's important. If we can understand people better and what they're going through, their paradoxes and their dilemmas, without actually using the terminology of existential philosophy. You know, it just helps us to understand the human experience better. And then we can empathize better. You know, we have another lens to access information from.
Can I say?
Mm-hmm.
Can we go back to that slide? The issue here, right, from a black woman, is I can't relate.
You need to get on there.
Huh? What is that?
You need to get on there.
I do, right? But as a person that I can't see that.
Yeah.
So when I find that I am speaking to people in, say, my culture or what have you, if there's no one there that represents us, then how is this going to land?
I give you an answer because I was hesitant to put these slides up because to me it doesn't matter one bit, because what we're interested in is not labels, it's not color, it's not speech, it's not geography. What we're interested in is the human experience.
How do we infiltrate, and I agree, how do we infiltrate into diverse communities this information when the language just doesn't land, when maybe we have different, experiences, we've, different sufferings within societies.
Yeah.
It's like, I want it to land to my people. When I speak to family members or I want to disseminate that information, it's like, oh, Corinne's the genius. I'm not, you know what I mean? It's just how is it, are there people trying to bring this to other cultures?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think all of us have a responsibility. That's again my bias speaking and my activism. But like, when we understand something about the human experience that you feel is helpful for your friends or your community, then you can translate those questions into a language or terminology or stories that make sense to who you're trying to convey it to, and then bring it out there. You know, after today, you will have some things to say in a way that you can say to somebody in your community that they would not listen to me, depending on how I'm phrasing it, some example of how it relates, some story that I don't have access to. What we said in the beginning is like, if I were different, then you would listen to me in a slightly different way. You know, depending on who you are, depending on assumptions that you have. So the philosophy is tight. The philosophy makes sense. It's logical. Philosophers use logic, and it's difficult to argue with logic with cultural contexts, because culture doesn't matter when it comes to logic. You know, so that's, I think, why it's so Western, because the practice of philosophy was a very privileged Western endeavor. But we can take the knowledge and translate it into a format that people understand. You know, different cultures, you can sample it and put it in a different framework. It's like when people sample a bit of music from the 80s and they put a fat bass underneath and a heavy snare and then some rap lyrics. You know, you still have the essence of what they're trying to communicate, a feeling perhaps that music has, but you put it into a context that makes sense to somebody who's 21.
Can I just make a comment about the East-West thing? I'm not sure how the philosophical underpinnings are applied in the coaching context. I'm interested in how it's going to work. But these questions are, I mean, they're universal. And, you know, Buddha as a word isn't Buddha. I speak Bengali, so that's Buddha for me, which relates to the word Buddhi. So there's a whole other way of understanding something so simple as just the word of what the chap's called, let alone what he actually wrote and why he was writing and the stories that might illustrate various concepts. I think the key is trying to learn and understand, like, in both directions, rather than just like dumping your own view in either way.
Yeah, and a lot of the core principles of every religion, they often have that in common. You know, it's often about love and compassion and sharing, and, like, you know, a lot is about unity and connection, and that goes through so many different philosophies, religions, paradigms, you know, so ideas can be communicated in different ways. So this is just one framework. You know, this is one lens to take, and many of these ideas are shared in many of the other frameworks too. So in short, often people ask, well, what is existentialism? The shortest answer is it's a philosophy of human lived existence, human lived experience. It's exploring the human condition. Ibn Yalom, by the way, a prolific writer. It's wonderful. He has the core text on existential psychotherapy, which is quite a heavy book. But he also writes his stories from therapy into stories, into novels, and he has a series of books. So it's just a joy to read and really bring you face to face with the existential themes that people come in touch with in a very engaging way. Death, freedom, isolation, and meaningless are the big four existential givens. I'll say a bit more about that in a bit more detail. Most of them we've already touched upon. Paradox, dilemma, anxiety are inevitable parts of the human experience because of these existential givens. So I say a bit more about that. They're holistic, they're universal, and they're inevitable. As soon as we are human and we exist, we will have to grapple with that sooner or later. First one, death. The existentialists are known always to talk a lot about death, but really what we are talking about is endings. We're talking about temporality. We're talking about time. We're talking about that time matters, because one of the things that we can know if we apply philosophy to figure out what the human condition is and what it means to be, one of those givens is time matters. At some point we go. Yes, philosophically time is a construct that might not really exist, but for our human experience, things end. Everything ends. And that's inevitable. And if it doesn't end, it'll change. That's an ending. You know, so you can feel the energy. I just had a client, and it was quite frustrating. I've talked about him in supervision quite a lot, because he came to coaching, he didn't really take a lot of action. And he tried to do, long story short, last week I saw him, and before he came and he just kind of sat down and, you know, he just didn't really seem to, like, oh, what am I doing here? And so last week he came, it's like, I want to talk about this, and I want to talk about that, and I want to talk about that. I'm like, oh, interesting. What's happening? And It was clear, well, we have one session left after this one. Time is a fantastic motivator. Turning 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, a birthday, starting the third year of uni, thinking about retirement, anything that brings into our mind time and endings does something. At some point I had a thought experiment and I thought, could it be amazing if we we trick our loved ones every 8 to 12 years into believing that they're going to die, like bribe the doctor or something and give them 3 months to live and make sure they don't go to Hawaii and rob that bank? Because whenever somebody feels, I mean, obviously highly unethical, please don't do it. I can see you eyeing me. But everybody I've met who had a near-death experience or a reminder that they might not have much time, they've changed their lives for what they thought was for the better. You know, it's a very powerful catalyst. I know a coach who often asks his clients, how many days do you think you have to live? And that can be quite a powerful question. I think you have to be quite careful again, because if somebody feels quite fragile, that's a difficult question to ask. But generally, it's a useful question because it brings into mind that you're not here forever. You know, how many people at some age, all of a sudden, they do still want to write that book. Or they quit their job and they start that company that they were really passionate about. You know, that feeling of I'm running out of time is a very powerful thing. We don't want to be reminded of it because it causes anxiety, but at the same time, it also creates energy.
What is the, if you're saying that, and you're absolutely right, that, you know, somebody might suddenly change their life for the better if they, for whatever reason, they perceive that time is short. Why do they wait for that? If your life can be changed for the better, why do you have to wait for a
Because it's comfortable.
It's because it's easy, fear of change.
Well, if we know we don't have that much, we feel the pressure and the responsibility to do something meaningful with our time. If we don't think about it, then we don't feel bad about it. You know, that's why people drink and smoke and they distract themselves in other ways. You know, they work super hard and they don't stop, and when they go on holiday, they go whitewater rafting, and when they sit at the beach, they read a super engaging novel. Because as soon as they sit still, stuff comes up. You know, and I really like that there's such a trend in meditation, because meditation, not the kind of meditation where you focus in on something, but the meditation where you just observe what's coming up. You know, because that is going to tell you something. And sometimes meditation gets a bad rep. I think from people, mostly from people who sit still and stuff comes up that they don't like, because it's your mind saying, "There's some stuff. Look at that," and you're like, "Oh, I don't want to look at that. I'll rather do some work." No? Well, I'll have a drink. I'm just thinking about time, and I'd really like to introduce that framework to you, and I think in that we need to move on. Is that okay?
Yes.
Can you park that for later? I won't play that, maybe at the end. We talked about meaning and meaninglessness, absurdity. We're meaning-making machines in a world that might not make sense overall, or we might not be able to grasp it. That's the paradox again. You know, in terms of death, we know we're going to die at some point. We don't know when. We don't want to think about it, but we really do, because it helps us to get lots of stuff done. You know, endings give our lives meaning. You know, meaninglessness is a thing, but we're meaning-making machines in a world that might not have any. Overall, only the meaning that we feel subjectively is meaningful to us, which might not be meaningful to somebody else. So does that really exist? You know, again, one of those paradoxes. I like that. Mr. Natural, what does it all mean? Don't mean shit. You know, because you can take that absurdity quite lighthearted. It's like, oh wow, if there's no meaning, no rules, it means I can do whatever I want. You know, if this is all a simulation, whoa. What could I do if none of this was real? What would you do if none of this was real? We're social animals. We need to relate to others. At the same time, nobody can really get us. Nobody can really truly understand us. Nobody can look into our heads and know what we're thinking. We might be married 50 years, and we might think we read our partner's minds. Sometimes that might be true, sometimes we might know what they think. But sometimes they leave us out of the blue and we don't know because something has been growing and we didn't pick up on it. You know, so we're social animals in a world where we're all unique and individuals. And like we try to connect, we try to say we go to the cinema when we have our first relationship. But really, we die alone and we got born alone. I think it was Bukowski or it might have been somebody else. But like, we have that existential isolation as human beings, but we really want to connect and belong and merge, even though that's not possible anymore. Hell is other people, as Jean-Paul Sartre said. We always compare ourselves, we can't help it. As soon as there's others, even if we're on a lonely island, we create in our imagination other people. Freedom, responsibility, we talked about that. That's a choice that Neo in the Matrix had to do. You know, do you want to know the truth, and it might be really uncomfortable, or do you want to live in an illusion, but you don't know that it's an illusion? People have different answers to that. It's a different choice with different builds. We are condemned to be free. We get to choose, but we also have to choose. And that's a wonderful paradox, because we like choice, but when we have too much choice, or when we are forced to choose, we also, as soon as we choose, we take responsibility for our choices. For so many people, it's so much easier if they have no choice. And how often do you hear that from clients? Oh, I have to, I ought to, I should, like it's not really up to me. Especially in organizations. We like to not accept responsibility. So all of that leads to uncertainty, anxiety, dilemma, paradox. They're just part of the human experience if we allow ourselves to open our eyes to the human condition. And we can embrace it, because it's the stuff that makes life exciting. If we had certainty about everything, if we knew the outcome of all of our choices, I mean, humans create chaos when things get too boring. You know, if it's too sure, then clients of mine, they tend to cause some disruption. If a relationship is too happy, often one of the partners acts out to create something. Because we like the energy that gets created between those two poles. You know, we don't want to know the outcome of the football game. We don't want to read the last page of the book first, at least most of us don't. You know, we don't want spoilers. Spoiler alert. You know, we don't want to know very often, but we want to feel safe in our not knowing. I'm going to skip that. So, very often we see that with our clients and ourselves, is that we live inauthentically. We don't live aligned with our values. We say we value fairness, but we do an unfair thing. You know, but we don't want to look at that, because that would bring us face to face with our inauthenticity. How many of us make up stories in our heads of what kind of person we are when we're actually not following that up with our actions? And when somebody comes up and says, you know, but you're kind, you say you're a kind person, but that wasn't kind. You know, we'd rather not look at that or deceive ourselves again. You know, there's certain politicians who are brought face to face with, but last week you said something else. And then they justify it. And I think many people genuinely believe they didn't say that. I know I've created some memories about myself. I've had a reunion recently with some friends, and I told a story from when we were like 18 or so. And quite a chunk of that didn't happen. Like I remember some stuff very clearly. And I'm like, oh, but I said that, and I defended that person. They're like, no, you didn't. It's like, and then the other three were like, no, you didn't. I'm like, oh, I totally created that memory of me like defending a friend when actually I didn't do that. I'm like, wow, the mind is a powerful thing. So a coach can actually allow you, because we have that relationship, that trusting relationships. I know my coach is on my side. They don't just say something. They don't just say, last week you said something else in order to trick me out or anything. I know they're on my side helping me to figure out, to go forward, to reach my goals. So if I build that trust, then my client can trust me that I'm on their side, even when I'm challenging them. So if we wanted to live more authentically, if we wanted to live more aligned, bad faith is denying our freedom to choose. You know, living in bad faith means you you are denying, like if you're saying, well, I couldn't do that, or I couldn't change my career, or now I'm too old in order to be X, you know, that's living in bad faith. So a coach can invite you to have, to develop the courage to go out there and do it, or at least to think about it. You know, it's hard work to live very aware of what's going on for you. It takes a lot of courage to choose. You know, often I don't want to choose. When I'm on holiday, I want to make as little choices as possible very often. You know, I become quite a follower when I'm on holidays. You know, because it's very relaxing not to make any decisions, because then I don't need to take any responsibility for how things turn out. It's easier to live through life being distracted and deceiving ourselves, being very busy. You know, but in the end, you're probably going to be looking back and I wish I had committed. That in the end was what made getting engaged and getting married for me so easy, because I looked back. I put myself